Hello, welcome to Crypted History Uncrypted. I think we're on episode 4, right?
Yeah.
I realized we didn't put that. So, yeah. How are you doing? We're finally doing
I'm
this.
doing good.
Like a million times. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah. There's just been a lot going on behind the scenes, but everybody's good and everything's fine. So we are here with episode 4 and we're going to talk about Nazi doctors.
Yeah. So I found this
some other things, but
psychiatrist behind Hitler. And that's essentially kind of sums it all up. Yeah. So,
yeah. So we've kind of paved the way up until now with talking about like the initial discovery of like psychiatry and psychology as fields of study and some of the initial interest in funding and the ideas and the philosophies behind it. And now we're getting to the part where this starts ramping up. The field is more established. It's looked at as scientific. We'll talk about whether or not we think it's truly scientific and how scientific we think it is. But we head into an interesting time period heading into World War II, where psychologists and psychiatrists kind of take this leading role in paving the way for a bunch of controversial ideas that are blossoming at this time and some ethical experimentation issues and things like that. So we're going to get into all of that today. So it's probably going to be a pretty somewhat emotionally charged topics and things like that. So if you're like super sensitive, just be aware. We're going to be talking about some darkish things and stuff like that. But I think it's important and I think it's interesting to talk about. So yeah.
For sure. And we were just talking before we went live, and it does seem like this field was created to legitimize a lot of these pretty dark philosophies and to scientize them. I don't know if that's not a word, but it's certainly not scientific, but I think they wanted to codify it into the field of hard science. And that was a way of doing it, was to put all this funding research into the field of psychiatry, which really wasn't up until this time period. It's really kind of the late 20s into the 30s where the field of psychiatry really got any attention at all and was seen as anything kind of respectable. So
yes, exactly. So psychology had already been kind of established as like a study of the mind and the soul and the inner workings of the mind and things like psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, but this is more the pharmacological aspect. Psychiatry is the attempt to treat or manage the human mind and anything that might be maladjusted or wrong with it with drugs and medical interventions. So, and this is a time in history where, because of Darwinism, as we kind of discussed in previous episodes, they are talking about evolution. Biological determinism is kind of the scientific ethos of the time. And so there's a lot of talk about how to steer evolution, right? How to point it in the direction we want it to go, maybe even accelerate it. So you get a lot of hygiene movements. And this is a word you're going to hear a lot, is hygiene. And you're thinking like, oh, brushing your teeth, using deodorant, taking showers. No, when they say hygiene, they're talking about cleaning up the human race. They're talking about getting rid of undesirables, getting rid of flaws, diseases, anything heritable or possibly heritable. And this is where it's like kind of dodgy as to the science, because again, it's an established field, but it's still new. So it's still very experimental. There's a lot of assumptions and hypotheses that are made at this time that have not been tested and have not really been verified, but they're treated as they are. And that's one thing that I don't think has changed. So when we're talking about like current times, you'll hear people now with like the transgender movement assert that we now know, and this is a logical fallacy that they love to spout all the time. We now know that we have to treat, gender affirming care reduces suicide by such and such and such. And they'll reference a study or something like that. But there hasn't been enough time, and human beings are so dynamic and there are so many variables that it's arguable whether that's something you can truly quantify to begin with. And then you look at the methods and you look at the funding and things just get muddier and muddier. And that was certainly the case back then. Now, most of what they're talking about here in the 30s and the 40s is stuff that is now considered to be completely debunked. So at the time, they're basing whole nations' laws on this. So maybe we'll just start with in the 30s.
Well, before we start, because you're talking about hygiene, it's kind of like all of these, the mental hygiene and all of these different hygiene camps that they create basically were just from racial hygiene. And that's really kind of what they're offshoots of. So
yeah, that's what started it. So you start with racial hygiene, and then the logical extension of something like that is going to be things like mental hygiene. You had like the Bureau of Mental Hygiene, then you get reproductive hygiene, you get basically they're looking at any kind of thing that science considers a flaw or a weakness in the species, and they're talking about eliminating it by eliminating people who have those things, or at least sterilizing them. And so this is where it does get controversial and a little bit disturbing for people, just so that you guys know. I don't want to you jump into the stream and we just go straight for the eugenics and you're like, whoa, I needed a little bit of a warning on that. So we are going to talk about that. But during this time, we're starting to see big funding come in. And this is because you had in the United States, David Rockefeller, the Rockefeller brothers, very interested in these movements. They're very interested in the hygiene movements. They start things like the Bureau of Hygiene here in the United States. And so when they see psychiatrists and psychologists who, I didn't even know this until we started doing this. I didn't realize that these fields were run by psychologists and psychiatrists. I always assumed it would have been like medical doctors, anthropologists, or biologists. No, it was psychiatrists and psychologists were really at the forefront of saying, okay, anybody who has, and I mean, they had very offensive terms that they would call people who had any sort of mental problems back then. They would call them things like idiots, the insane, all the things that you probably aren't allowed to say now about people. Right. Those were the terms they would use. And it was everything from like, oh, you were born deaf, or you had a club foot, or you had a cleft palate, to you had something resembling autism or some kind of learning disability, anything like that. Anything they thought could be heritable, they were already talking about ways to eliminate that through limiting who's allowed to reproduce and how often and how much and things like that. And so it led to a lot of sterilization programs and things of that nature. And at this time in history, we're not just talking about Germany, although it was very popular and everyone knows that this happened in Germany in the 30s. It was happening in many countries in the West. I think Denmark, there were places in the United States where this kind of stuff was done, Canada, the UK. There were many countries that had laws written based on this science, which I would now say is pseudoscience. So the people funding it is a big piece to this, because the reason that I believe these people funded these programs and these studies, these experiments, was because they had a vested interest in these types of hygiene. They wanted a certain kind of workforce. They wanted a certain kind of population that was easy to manage. They were really looking at it as a tool for control and social engineering and biologically engineered human beings and trying to play God. So I kind of started with a guy I mentioned in previous episodes, Emil Kraepelin, because he was the one in Germany that started the Kaiser Wilhelm Society. And he did that with Rockefeller funding and with funding from James Loeb, who's not often talked about, and he should be talked about. The Loeb family is a banking family, very influential. I don't think they get the attention they deserve. So I did a little bit here on them. So when Emil Kraepelin was talking about psychiatric genetics, he was like the founding father of genetic psychiatry, and this idea that mental illness or any type of disease could be heritable. Mental diseases or diseases of the mind could be inherited. Again, even in the 90s when I was growing up, because my mother had schizophrenia, I was told this all the time. I was always told that these are totally heritable. There's probably a gene. We just haven't found it yet.
Well, this is
Turns out now that maybe not.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. This is where I think the psychiatry really comes into play
Yeah.
because oftentimes, and this is just the cynic in me, but I think they create these things they work backwards to legitimize the theories that they want to
Yes.
put forth that oftentimes are really propaganda. And schizophrenia was actually one of the big ones for them. So they created all this testing around schizophrenia and schizophrenia. And it's interesting because the same time period where with during the Holocaust, it was all around that the Jews were diseased, right? And what was the disease? It was tuberculosis, actually.
Right.
And so they were doing all this testing for tuberculosis. It seems very similar to what happened in the past few years, right? Those people were diseased, and so we had to cleanse them. They used the same playbook over and over again. It's kind of mind-boggling that people don't catch on, but I think schizophrenia was one of those, that they were doing. That when we talk about like the Tavistock Institute, it's this social science research in order to work backwards to justify their theories. Like they actually wrote a book later when we get to T4, like redistributive justice, and it was also to like basically to validate all the euthanasia they'd done. But schizophrenia was one of the ones that they were really constantly testing. And of course, later we find out that there was actually no hereditary component, but and the law they actually passed, and it was, I think, Germany who helmed it. It was 1933, the Prevention for Hereditary Diseased Offspring. It was an actual law that they passed.
Yes, it was an actual law. And then they had the Nuremberg laws based around that, which became a whole set of laws saying who was allowed to procreate with whom. It talked about miscegenation. It talked about all kinds of very, what we would consider now to be really crazy, insane eugenics type of ideas. But yes, it was based on this law that, and so we're talking about Emil Kraepelin. He was the first guy to say, oh, I think that most mental illness is hereditary. There's a gene for it. It's probably genetic. They didn't say gene then because they didn't know about DNA or anything. So they would call it heritability or inheritance, that you could inherit these things through some biological mechanism. So even though they didn't know what it was, they'd say, oh, if we see it in families, it must be a biological inheritance. Of course, now we know that that's like a correlation that, say you grow up with an alcoholic abusive parent, it makes sense that you could have a higher chance of modeling that behavior or using those same habits to adapt when you become an adult, just because those behaviors were modeled for you, rather than it being a genetic predisposition. And that's what now they're very reluctantly and very quietly admitting this now. But all the way through the 90s and even the early 2000s, they kept with this idea that, everything from being gay to schizophrenic is a genetic disorder, that you're just born like that, and it's a biological mechanism. So Kraepelin was the first to...
They also now have debunked a lot of genetics with epigenetics.
Yes.
So that's like the, not to say that doesn't have a component, but that's really kind of it's undermining most of the field of genetics. But again, I think genetics was just a way of kind of solidifying these biological explanations because they can't justify their racial hygiene and their social Darwinism if they don't have biological components.
They felt like this was a bulletproof thing that kind of made them immune from criticism. And they would say, well, look, if this is just an inherited thing, then this is the obvious thing we should do. And I think you're right, they were justifying it. Like in Russia around this time, in the 30s and 40s in Russia, they had something called, what was it called? Like lazy schizophrenia. And that basically, it was a term they came up with. So if you weren't down with communism, if you weren't completely like down with Stalinist communism, they would say your political dissidence was a form of schizophrenia, and they would institutionalize you. So they weaponized and abused psychiatry in Soviet times in Russia. They did the same thing elsewhere. So, and I didn't know, like I knew a little of this. I didn't know how widespread it was. I didn't know how incredibly ubiquitous this was at the time, that kind of anybody who was problematic could be institutionalized based on that. And when that happened, these people were experimented on a lot. So it was kind of a wonderful thing for the elites, because it was like, well, you're problematic for us, you're a dissident, and so not only can we get rid of you, but we can also use you to experiment on. So Kraepelin gets these large donations starting in 1911 and then 1913 from both the Rockefeller Foundation and James Loeb, who was part of the Loeb family. Now I want to take a slight detour to talk to you guys about the Loeb family, because in the last episode we talked about this weird phenomenon of these bankers always being involved, these giant, Federal Reserve or reserve banking empires backing psychology and psychiatry. And you think to yourself, well, that's a little weird, because there's a lot of other academic fields or medical fields that have funding from other sources that are not banking. So it seemed a little bit odd to me that we have these giant banking interests involved, and this is certainly the case here. And the reason I think it's important is because you will see how these institutions were set up and how they were created and prepped for what became post-World War II, the MK Ultra program. Yeah. That program did not just appear out of thin air. It wasn't just invented, after the Korean War because we were worried that, the Koreans or the Soviets had mind control weapons. That's actually a CIA cover story. So really, this was being set up prior to that and by these same people. So the Loeb family, James Loeb was a son of some really prominent bankers, who were all these families are always connected, right?
Yeah.
So you had Loeb and Kuhn was like one of the big early financial institutions, one of the few investment banks that's still around now. So you would have had like JP Morgan was number one, Loeb and Kuhn was number two. And they are also married into the Schiff family. So if you guys know Jacob Schiff or some of the Schiff banking family and some of the things they're involved in, they were also married into the Warburg family. So the Loeb family is connected to M.M. Warburg and Company, to Felix Warburg. You guys probably have heard of Paul Warburg and how the Warburg banking dynasty was very instrumental in World War II, and some other things that came along after that I probably shouldn't say.
Warburg, Saxon.
Yes. And they're the ones that set up the Federal Reserve System. Oh. And so Loeb is part of this family, and he gives Emil Kraepelin this large donation to start what became the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which was the center of all the Nazi eugenics stuff. It's kind of where all this stuff came from. And I as I'm researching it, I saw a bunch of other researchers going, that's weird because these are Jewish families. Why would they fund that? Well, I mean, it's postulated maybe they didn't know about some of the anti-Semitic type of stuff going on in Germany, but it's also something you see all the time where these are powerful elites. They don't necessarily care about the common Jewish person, or like the British elite don't care about the common British person. Certainly what the British Empire did wasn't great for the average Brit, right?
Well, I think I think that's true. I think there's another component, though, that people often overlook. And I think it's a very relevant component today, because I'll bring the example to the forefront. Like everybody knows about Bud Light, right? And the thing I keep hearing people say is, this is so stupid. Don't they know their market? Yeah. Like they're going to lose so much money. And I'm just dumbfounded by it, because I'm like, it's not about money. This is about ESG. And what people don't realize is that they think they're going to, when all these companies get obliterated, they think they're going to be the one man standing and they will have total control. And I think there is the possibility that some of these, first of all, many of these quote unquote Jews weren't Jews. I mean, they weren't. Right. Exactly. A lot of them were actually Satanists, like they weren't Jews at all.
Right.
But there is the possibility that some of them who were thought it was a way of saving themselves, that they were then going to be part of the elites who would then be spared from.
Right. That's what I mean. They're thinking this is good for me. And if the rest of the the low level people out there get eliminated, well, got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. But it was also that people think that everything that happened in World War II was mainly just to Jewish people, but there were many groups that were affected. Many other groups, different genetic groups and racial groups and people. It was all kinds of people who fell under the sword, right? So, and this was pitched to these people as like, it's our duty. It's our duty to steer the race in the way that it should go and eliminate. It's always eliminate suffering, right? If we just kill off a whole bunch of people now, it eliminates suffering down the line. And you hear that now. You hear that now when people are arguing for abortion. They'll act like if you're raised in a poor family, you might as well not exist.
Well, in Canada, they're doing that. That's what MAID is all about. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Kill
yeah.
yourself.
Oh, you have a chronic disease? Here, let us help you kill yourself. It was that. Yeah, this stuff never went away, by the way, guys. This stuff never went away.
It didn't. And I'm going to just apologize, but interrupt with this quote because this basically sums up how they felt. So this is by Eugene Bleuler, who was in the textbook. Have you read this? Okay. This is textbook of psychiatry. And this is what he says. The more severely burdened should not propagate themselves. If we do nothing but make mental and physical cripples capable of propagating themselves, and the healthy stocks have to limit the number of their children because so much has to be done for the maintenance of others. If natural selection is generally suppressed, then unless we get new measures, our race must rapidly deteriorate. This is exact. So they really thought they were doing good. This
is the problem with scientists thinking that they're God and that they know everything, and that especially for such a new field, for them to feel like they really just had this all figured out and knew exactly what to do, in hindsight, for us at least, seems very absurd to me. Like, who do you think you are? Because they acted like, it's kind of similar to me with climate change, where it's like they're like, oh, hey, we discovered biology and genetics. That means, oh gosh, suddenly the whole race is on the decline. We're ruining natural selection. So we better, speed it up the other direction. We better take control and start engineering everything. And certainly there will be no unintended bad outcomes or unintended consequences of it. Right. So it was kind of the same thought process. They really believed that like the species was devolving and that, we should be getting rid of the weak. So it was pitched to the elites this way. So they fund Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Also, the Solomon and Loeb banking families, they also gave money to start. So it was the German Institute of Psychiatry first. Then it became the Kaiser Wilhelm Society. Then it became the Max Planck Institute. Right. So they started that. And I dug up the Rockefeller Foundation annual report from 1932, and boy, were there some gems in there, you guys. Oh my gosh, it's so insane because you can go right to the Rockefeller archive and read through this stuff. But of course, most people don't. It's a hundreds of pages long report, and it took some digging to find like the parts that I wanted, but I did find them, and it was quite something. So on page 211 of that report, they're explaining their motivations for this. So let me just read you this little snippet. They said, special attention has been given to the field of psychiatry. The number of hospital beds dedicated to the care of mental cases exceeds in many countries the number of beds for all other cases combined. How badly needed is knowledge in this field may be inferred from the economic, moral, social, and spiritual losses occasioned by the criminally insane, delinquents, feeble-minded, emotionally unstable, and psychopathic. So they said, we need more study of the nervous system. And it was funny because they called it internal secretions. I'm thinking that would have been like hormones, things of that nature, and then heredity. So they said advanced psychobiology has been retarded by social taboos. So this was in the Rockefeller Foundation report. They're arguing that, if only we could do a bunch of like unethical, inhumane experimentation, we could really figure this out. But unfortunately, these things are very taboo and people don't seem to like it when we do this stuff. And so they noted in the report that this was holding them back and that another field urgently calling for further development was hygiene. So again, the word hygiene comes up. So they're talking on page 213 then. this is their justification for what they're doing. And then they say, so given this, our largest appropriations for 1932 in all of the medical sciences are going to go to McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And they gave them almost $1.3 million. That's 1932 money. I don't know how much that is in 2023 money, but it's a lot.
Yep.
The largest donation was made to McGill University at Montreal, Canada, to establish the Neurological Institute and fund research activities in mental and nervous diseases. Guidance is entrusted to Dr. Wilder Penfield, who I'm going to go over. He's a very important, very underrated, and not talked about enough. So if you guys do know anything about MK Ultra, McGill University is, I consider it like the premier institution for MK Ultra, because we have the greatest record keeping. We have victims of what happened there still alive today. They're in the midst of a lawsuit. We have really rock solid evidence, tons of records spanning over a decade of some of the horrific human experimentation that was done on people there. And here you have in the Rockefeller Annual Report for 1932, them saying, we're establishing this, we are creating it, and they tell you that that's what it's for. So this idea that it was a mistake or it was a regrettable, like, oh, we didn't know. No, they knew. So the CIA was running the program, but the Rockefeller Foundation was well aware of everything that was going on. And they were doing this for the purpose of hygiene. So they're doing this to find out, what can we do with people that we deem unfit? How can we program them? Can we deprogram them? Can we sterilize them? What can we do to them? And how can we experiment on them? Because after all, they're there because they're crazy. Now, the people who were experimented on, some of them were there for things like just postpartum depression, for mild clinical depression. Some of them were there for like a minor nervous disorder. These were not like criminally insane types. These were normal citizens with minor mental disturbances that they were looking for a little bit of help. And this program experimented on them. So
yeah, I do want to add that one of the things that the Rockefellers also funded was, we've talked about the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, but they also funded a Institute of Human Relations at Yale. And that one was primarily focused on psychological disorders and law. And I find that so because you said like they're not criminally insane, right?
Right.
I find that so fascinating because when you look at the shift of the DSM, it looks like most of it was done for legal purposes. Yes. Because when you in a court of law, people can plead insanity, right? That's one way that they can lessen their plea. They can, now, and then of course they did away with the institutions, the quote unquote institutions. So now there's really no place for them to go. But it is more of a legal issue than,
Yeah, so they were setting up for that sort of thing for sure. Another thing in the report talks about a donation made in 1932 to Professor Eugen Fischer, who was at the Nuremberg trials, was one of the primary people implicated in a lot of the euthanasia programs. And they gave him a $9,000 grant that year. He was a Nazi. In 1927, he became the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And he was in the anthropology, human heredity, and eugenics division. He was responsible for providing the scientific evidence that was used as a basis to support the Nuremberg laws and forced sterilization of 800 mixed race children in Germany who were referred to as the Rhineland bastards. So if you guys have never heard this story, in World War I, the British Empire and even the French and the Germans, they used a lot of their like black slaves from their colonized areas in Africa as troops and soldiers and guards and things like that. And they brought some of them to Europe for that purpose in World War I. Well, some of them stayed after World War I, and there were, it was a small amount, but there was a significant enough community of mixed race children that the Germans didn't like, and they had a whole entire program, and it was based on this professor's work, who was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, who wrote a whole report. And if you read it, it's scientific nonsense. It's not scientific at all, in other words. it's this stuff that's been debunked now of where they're measuring skull shapes and doing this total pseudoscientific nonsense to justify. They kidnapped these children and from their parents, took them forcibly, put them on buses, and took them to be sterilized. And all of this was overseen not by soldiers, not by prison guards, not by politicians, by psychiatrists and psychologists. These were the people who provided the scientific justification to do this to these kids. And then eventually it ended up being hundreds of thousands of more people that were forcibly sterilized and or euthanized down the line. So it's all in this 1932 annual report from the Rockefeller Foundation that they funded these things and they knew what they were funding and that they thought this was a good thing. So this idea that you'll get and that you'll hear repeated, especially by people who are in the fields now of psychiatry and psychology or biology or genetics and things like that, and they'll act like, oh, well, they didn't really know what they were doing, or they were doing the best they could with what they had at the time. The kind of typical stuff that tries to excuse these things away. But you can clearly go back and just read the documentation and see that they knew exactly what they were doing. Yeah, they thought it was good, but this is why it's so important to talk about things like philosophy and religion and morality and things like that, because when you tear apart the materialist worldview, there is no justification for doing this to people. And this is why you don't really want a world that's run based on pragmatism or rationalism or things like that, because it takes this human element out and you're just left with this biological determinism that says, if you're flawed, we should just get rid of you.
Yeah.
And you think of all the people in the last 100 years who were flawed in some way and became great, influential, amazing human beings who contributed so much to society and to the world, who wouldn't have existed if this philosophy had continued, and not that it hasn't continued, but if it had become the dominant thing and everybody went with it, how bad it could have been. For so sure. I don't know if you want to go anywhere from there.
Maybe I don't know, because there might be a big rabbit trail. I can save it. Yeah.
Okay. Then I will talk briefly about the Bureau of Social Hygiene, which was also started by the Rockefellers. And the Bureau of Social Hygiene is interesting because it was an agency, but funds were channeled through it to go to other things, including Paul Warburg's, banking stuff, whatever they were doing there. They were channeling funds through this to him and to the Spellman Fund, which we talked about in the last episode, which was another kind of cover program for eugenics. So, and then I already spoke a little bit about how Russia in the same time period was using schizophrenia as an excuse to punish political dissidents and put people in camps and things like that. So they could just have, one of Stalin's psychiatrists declare you insane if you objected to communism, and that was that for you. The next doctor I want to talk about, who is, so you have your MK Ultra doctors, and then you have your MK Ultra doctor daddies, who were like their mentors, who trained these people. One such person would be Stanley Cobb. So Dr. Stanley Cobb's an interesting guy. He founded the Harvard Department of Neurology in 1925 and the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard in 1934, both with Rockefeller Foundation funding again. And he was good friends with Alan Gregg, who we talked about in the last episode as well, running a lot of programs for the Rockefeller Foundation, being involved with the UN and the global New World Order banking system and all this stuff. So you're going to find this a lot where you have these doctors who are psychologists and psychiatrists setting up these departments at major universities with big foundation money. And then they're also involved in banking. They're all part of the UN. They're all part of UNESCO. Like all these things, it's like a giant, it's similar. The same thing goes on today. People don't know this, but the same thing goes on today. When we're talking about they, and people go, who are they? When we say they want to control us or they want to do this to us, they are the people in these institutions who steer everything. They're in these big institutions. They're in banking, they're in the UN, and they're in steering committees, right? So Stanley Cobb's tied in with all of these powerful elites. He's getting all their funding. Very interesting. Cobb's great-grandmother, Augusta Adams Cobb, left her husband in 1843 to marry Brigham Young. She became wife number 3 of his 56 wives. And I haven't totally gotten to the bottom of this yet, but I keep running into Mormons, you guys. I keep running into Mormons in the psychology and psychiatry field. And whenever there seems to be an abuse of psychology and psychiatry, there's a Mormon to be found. I think it has to do with the fact that, like, I would consider, sorry, Mormons, I know many of you are very nice, very good people, but I do think that the LDS church, especially the more fundamentalist ones, are definitely a cult. They're tied in with intelligence and things like that. So I think maybe that's part of why. But weirdly, we're going to run into a lot of Mormons. So
there's also, I know, I mean, I personally think the tops of any kind of major institution, including a lot of religious institutions, are all tied.
yes.
Most of them have intelligence connections. And
yeah, it's another institutional capture.
Yeah.
Why you see it in the Vatican and all that. So
exactly. But
so
I do
for whatever
know
reason here, you see a lot of Mormons.
Sure. No, I do know it. But I was going to say there is something, because I interviewed someone who's doing a lawsuit right now in Utah. And they were talking about like how the children are taken away. And I don't know if that's true in other organizations. Yeah. So I think that makes them more susceptible to a lot of this types of.
I think so.
Yeah.
There's a documentary on Netflix right now about.
It means that you can infiltrate, and bad people can get in and do things that they possibly couldn't do without having that cover for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember Warren Jeffs and the whole FLDS trial that was big around 2007, 2008? Yep. There's a documentary on Netflix about it right now that absolutely blew my mind. And that Warren Jeffs is still running the FLDS church and those commune cults from prison, and has been for the last 15 years. He's still in charge. The abuse is still happening. Yes, they took 550 children from their mothers.
Wow.
During that time, and I believe that's still going on. They'll take them as toddlers and send them to their compound in Texas, where they're supposed to be being prepared for the new kingdom. And of course, that's why Warren Jeffs is in prison, because they found video of him abusing these children in a ritualistic manner. So yeah, for that, it's always tied in, unfortunately. So Stanley Cobb's great-grandmother was one of Brigham Young's wives, sorry. So that's just an interesting tidbit. But he studied biology and medicine at Harvard. He did Army service in World War I. So that's another thing you find over and over and over. These guys.
They're all former military. Yeah.
They're all former military. They always end up in the military for at least a stint. And then when they get out, they get these big, powerful, influential positions, which is exactly what happened to Cobb. So he went back to Harvard in 1919 to teach neurology. And in 1930, he became the director of Harvard Neurological Unit at Boston City Hospital. And then he moved to Massachusetts General in 1934. And I will tell you, I did a ton of research on Massachusetts General and Boston Hospital when I was doing the Britney Spears series with Jamie Hanshaw.
Yeah.
I believe that hospital continued the MK Ultra stuff into the 80s and 90s. There were multiple lawsuits where they would keep getting caught doing this stuff, and the families would sue, and they kind of had a special lawyer picked to go represent these people whenever that would happen, who was kind of owned and controlled by these people, to make sure it will just pay them out and will say we fixed the problem and that there's nothing else going on, and then they would just continue the program. Mm-hmm. So I definitely see the roots of it going back to at least the 30s here. And Cobb is the one who built that psych unit at Massachusetts General that we know was being used for MK Ultra all throughout, and probably into the 80s and 90s, and maybe even still to this day. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, just to put the legal disclaimer out there. Another interesting thing about Cobb is he was good pals with Carl Jung, and Jung stayed with Cobb in 1936 when he came to America for a visit. So he was tied into the Jungian circles as well.
And let's not forget that Jung was a double agent, 488. for both
Yes.
the OSS and the United States. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know Jay
And
is
Germany,
streaming at the
sorry, the
same time
SS and OSS. Yeah.
yeah, Jay Dyer's streaming right now while we're streaming, and this is sounding a lot like a Jay stream at this point because we've got intelligence, we've got religious cults, we've got eugenics, we've got institutional capture all wrapped up into
All
this.
wrapped in one.
Yeah. But another interesting thing about Cobb
When I
was
get to the Tavistock stuff, we'll see some pretty interesting connections to the military and psychiatry and how it's a cover for that. But yeah.
I bet. So last thing about Cobb, just there was something called the mind-body problem, which was this debate that's been going on since the beginning of. Yes. Is it a mind thing? Is the mind like a spiritual thing? Is it a spiritual thing? Is it a biological thing? Is it both? Like, what is it? And Cobb said he believed there was no such distinction. He believed the problem to be settled in 1943, and that the mind is just the brain. And I have debated people now who believe that. I've debated people in the last 2 years who believe that consciousness, humanity, your mind, they don't really believe in a soul. They just think that you are just the higher faculties of your neurology, and that's it.
Can I interject with something here?
Yeah.
Because I have interviewed a couple of these people who believe this, and I'm not accusing them. I think most of them are wonderful people, and they genuinely believe this. I may be wrong, but that's I'll just put that out there. But I actually do think that there is a intentional psyop occurring that is to lead the people who were in the New Age. This is speculation. I'm just putting this out as a disclaimer. This is a theory, but I actually do think it is like a possibly an intelligence psyop that's going on because some of these people are very suspiciously connected, like very powerful people who've been given, I believe they've been given a narrative or somehow taken a bait for a narrative. We could say it that way. But what I think it is to lead the people who were in the New Age movement and to give them a slight spin on the New Age movement. So it is still, I think, somewhat of like a enlightenment type of a philosophy. Yeah. And it's definitely still, you can call it whatever you want to call it. If you want to call it Luciferian, enlightenment. But I think it is kind of this false light, but it's to guide people who think that they have woken up from the lie of the New Age. And now they're following something that is a little bit more, at least has the illusion or the appearance of being more scientific.
Yeah.
And it still has this concept of there being God, but very much like the New Age movement, God is more of this all one. And so now they've replaced it with this, instead of it being the light, it's consciousness is now the
collective consciousness. Yes, I agree with you because I've seen that, and I've debated these people too, where I'm just like, wait a second now, there might be some problems with that. But yeah, he was a proponent, and this is another thing we see where it's like the science is settled. This is no longer a question. You're not allowed to question it. We figured it out in 1943. There is no mind-body problem. Everything's just higher faculties of the brain. Everything is just neurology. And of course, by that extension, then there's no problem with eugenics. There's no problem with a lot of these things. These things are unfortunate but necessary tools, right?
Well, and I think it's also to promulgate the notion of simulation. Yeah. Because I personally, and again, this is my theory, I think that their goal, is Kurzweilian, the singularity is near. And I do think the singularity is near for them. For the elites, I think that's where they want the AI Hyborg mind that they program. And
the metaverse.
And put us all into a simulation. But I think a lot of this narrative that's circulating is to get people closer to the notion of us already being in a simulation so that they accept a lot of this transhuman agenda. Yeah. Again, that's just my theory, but yeah.
Well, and I think that when you adopt this kind of a worldview, I think that's kind of where it has to go. There's nowhere else to go with it because you still need some semblance of some kind of meaning in life or something to care about. And so it ends up being this transhumanist philosophy that it is Luciferian because it's this idea that we're God. And again, it's like the scientific class, the technocrats and the scientific class are going to manage humanity. They're going to engineer, they're going to fix it, right? They're going to, whatever, God, if you believe in him, whatever he screwed up or wherever he failed, they're going to fix it and make it right. And so that seemed to be over and over what I was getting from all these people that I've spent so much time reading about. So then we go to London, we go to Britain. So if you guys don't know, MK Ultra was not just something that happened here in the US or even in Canada. It was all over the world. It happened in the UK, Sweden, Australia, basically anywhere in the Western world, Germany. Because
one day I'm doing a live stream on this book, The Milner-Fabian Conspiracy.
Nice.
So for anybody who thinks that that this was just relegated to the United States,
No, absolutely not. So and these people all trained together. This is another thing that really helped me connect the dots early on in research about this sort of thing, was to see that these people, so we talked about how the institutions were Rockefeller funded. Well, a lot of these doctors, including this one, his name is William Sargant. He's probably one of the worst ones. Reading about him gives me the willies. He had a Rockefeller fellowship to travel in 1938 to study at Harvard in Boston with Stanley Cobb. Once they trained Sargant, he trained one of the worst guys in Australia, Dr. Harry Bailey. Harry Bailey, Stanley Cobb, William Sargant also worked with Dr. Ewan Cameron at McGill. So these MK Ultra doctors, in some places things were compartmentalized, right? You guys know about compartmentalization. Some stuff was compartmentalized, but a lot of these main doctors who were given the most funding, they all studied together and they built off of each other's work. So Sargant was in London. He began working at Maudsley Hospital, which is another hospital that I consider to be an MK Ultra hub. He started there in 1935, testing amphetamine for depression. He was interesting because a lot of these doctors got into psychology, and I feel like this still happens a lot, because they had mental problems themselves, right?
Research is me search.
Research is me search. That's right. So he was definitely in this category. So he tested things like amphetamines and other different drugs on himself. Amphetamines were big in the 30s. Everybody was really into taking some amphetamines and seeing what they could do with them. And he was one, and they were testing it for depression. So he went to study at Harvard under Stanley Cobb. He also, while he was in the United States, met with a doctor named Walter Freeman, who was the premier lobotomist. So now we're getting into lobotomy. So because they're believing this is a brain problem, because they're believing anything that might be wrong with you must come from your brain, because that's where your consciousness or your thought processes or whatever makes you must come from your brain, that we'll just take the frontal lobe, which is where all your higher faculties are, and we'll just cut that off from the rest of your brain. So most people have probably heard that, like, some of the Kennedy family, like when they had a crazy person in the family, they would get them lobotomized, and that this was a fairly common practice in the 30s through maybe the 50s, 60s. Walter Freeman was doing the most lobotomies in the United States. He taught Sargant how to do it. So while he was here studying, and this is another thing I find all throughout, he's studying with this doctor who does all these lobotomies, and they're studying the patient outcomes, and they're not good, right? They're not good, yet they're continuing to do it anyway. They just keep going with it. And so even though the outcomes were not very good, Sargant was determined that he was going to bring this practice to the UK. So he returns to the UK. He starts performing lobotomies there. Even though it's not successful for the patient, it doesn't help them. It just kind of makes them less problematic for the people around them, perhaps, or shuts them up a bit, makes them more manageable. But there were a lot of problems.
The job that they now have pharmaceutical drugs.
Exactly. Exactly. So
they've now come up with a pill for that pesky little problem. So back then they didn't. So they would actually
just pharmaceutically lobotomize you. Yeah, that's what they do. Mm-hmm. But at this point, they're doing surgery, and they're just going in through the temples and literally cutting the parts of the brain that connect the frontal lobe to the rest of the brain. And he did thousands of these. And he was known, like he developed a reputation in the UK for being a little too willing to do brain surgery on people, being a little too excited to lobotomize everyone he came into contact with. And he trained other doctors in all around the UK. He went to Wales, Scotland, Ireland to teach people his particular surgical techniques on how to lobotomize patients. And of course, World War II starts ramping up. He returns to Britain in 1939 and was assigned to Belmont Hospital, which was part of Maudsley. Maudsley had gotten split into two hospitals, Belmont and another one that I can't remember the name of off the top of my head. And he starts working with Elliot Slater, who's another like precursor to MKUltra. They start working together, and the two of them kind of develop this reputation for being kind of mad scientist types. Like they were not well regarded. They were kind of regarded as cruel or almost sadistic, kind of mad scientist type of doctors who are testing things on people. So during World War II, he gets around some of the problems. Like a lot of the hospital higher ups noticed that this guy was causing some trouble and there was a lot of controversy. And so they would frequently tell him, like he would say, I want to lobotomize this patient. And they would say, no, you can't. So he would send the patient to Slater at the other hospital, the other half of Maudsley, and get it done there. And he said it was a workaround the red tape. And he called it, let's see, what did he call it?
Are you talking about Mapother or
what?
Mapother?
I don't think so.
Okay.
This is Elliot Slater and William Sargant in London. So trying to find ways to work around the red tape to do experimental treatments on patients that the hospital administration didn't want them doing. He called it doing good by stealth. That was his phrase that he used, doing good by stealth. And his critics suggested that he was motivated by anger or sadism and said he was very irresponsible. So he was trying to get appointments at bigger hospitals and trying to get more funding, and he kept getting denied because he had already got this reputation as being pretty scary. But he experimented on a large number of war casualties with trauma who were coming back from the war using abreaction. I'm thinking you might know more about this than I do. It was the process of re-traumatizing people under the influence of drugs. So they would drug them up with usually barbiturates, sometimes other things, and then re-traumatize them to see what would happen, which is highly unethical, like nightmarishly horrific thing to do. Take somebody who's traumatized by wartime atrocities, drug them, and then make them relive the trauma to see.
Yeah,
and just to see what would happen. It wasn't even necessarily because they thought this was a cure. It was because they were testing to see how far you could push people's minds.
Yeah, well, I feel like that's what most of what all of whenever we look into this wartime research, it's like the excuse to be able to do whatever they want, and they don't really reveal it till later. But I do think that that's so much of what then led to the MKUltra studies. Because now they knew how people responded, and what we see, and I mean, this is whenever I see it throughout all the research that we do, but definitely when I look at Tavistock, it seems like they do all of that study, and then they take it and they weaponize it. So it becomes not just on that individual, but then how can we tweak this further so that we can further manipulate and control people?
Yeah. So he had these ways of getting around the system to be able to do these experiments that were not approved. And he did get some funding and got put in charge at St. George Hospital. And what I gathered from that was they kind of gave him a basement they weren't really using. This sounds terrible, but he took this research position and started this new department, which was just an empty basement. And he saw all this potential for basically turning it into kind of like a secret experimental lab. So I really feel like Sargant, I know for sure he was involved in MKUltra going further in time, but I feel like this was, he kind of built a roadmap, right, where we can get funding and then kind of on the down low in the basement of the hospital where nobody ever goes, we can set up a bunch of beds and create a lab and call it research and do experiments. So he was one of the first to experiment with electroconvulsive therapy on patients.
Yep.
And he was also one of the pioneers of this deep sleep therapy that we see a lot of in MK Ultra, which is basically you just put people into a medically induced coma for really sometimes ungodly amounts of time, sometimes 9 months. They would put people under and then do things to them while they're in a coma. Everything from hypnosis techniques to playing audio tracks in an attempt to program them or deprogram them. Things like psychic driving experiments like you and Cameron did. So he did this deep sleep therapy, he called it. And this is another case where he could clearly see this wasn't helping patients. It's not like, oh, this is just curing people, and so I have to keep going. No, it was like really catastrophic things were happening to these people. Some of them died. A lot of them died. Some of them were permanently disabled from these treatments. A few of them would wake up and understandably be a lot more chill than when they went in. So maybe they could have considered that a success, but you basically just turned the person into a zombie is all that you did. So
yeah,
that's what he did. He got this funding and created an experimental lab in the basement of St. Thomas Hospital doing these experiments. And then he was the one who later trained Dr. Cameron and Dr. Bailey and some of these really preeminent, very prolific MK Ultra doctors. So yeah, I think the other stuff I have kind of gets further past this episode into the next one. So
okay, I just wanted to add to this when you're talking about the reason I brought up Mapother. So Mapother was one of the heads of Maudsley, and it was him and Mott were the two psychiatrists, and they had a like major kind of, I guess we'll call them philosophical differences about where research and funding should be placed. And they struggled with, I think they opened in the early 1920s. It was like, I think 1924. But it became, they then needed more funding. And so it didn't become really established until 1938 when the Rockefeller Foundation came in.
Yep. And that is when they had Sargant working there because he had a Rockefeller fellowship.
Yeah.
So if you're wondering, like, how do these crazies get into these positions of power? It's because it's through these things. So I have an article on my Substack, and I did an episode with Jay about institutional capture and how this works. And these big philanthropic foundations, these big universities where there's lots of money, power, and influence, they can handpick people who they know are going to do the research that they want, right? So they can find kind of the more crazy people and they get recruited. These people don't just get there by happenstance. No. They're not just like the smartest, best doctor and that's how they get there. They're always handpicked because they're willing to do things like work around the red tape or do things that are a bit unethical or bend the rules or things like that. So on that note, our next doctor is Dr. Wilder Penfield. Now, this is the guy who the Rockefeller Foundation gave this $1.3 million grant to establish the Neurology Institute at McGill, which later became a hub of MKUltra experimentation. And Penfield was really instrumental in this. So this guy was very smart, and he had the same pedigree that a lot of these handpicked by the establishment people have. He got a Rhodes Scholarship. He went to Princeton, from Princeton to Oxford. From Oxford, he went to Johns Hopkins. So he's got the pedigree they're looking for. He goes to New York in the late 1920s to work at the Neurological Institute of New York. And while he's there, he meets David Rockefeller. And Rockefeller wants to give him an institute. He's, at this point in time, Penfield is studying like seizure disorders and some pretty actually real biology, like real neurobiology he's studying at this point. So when Rockefeller meets him and hears about his work and sees that this guy really is a genius, Penfield really was a genius, and he was, you know, already ingrained in all the institutions. He was in with a lot of the elites already. So when Rockefeller met him, he said, boy, I would love to give you an institute supposedly to study epilepsy, but academic politics in New York prevented this. I kept running into that phrase doing the research. And I think that sounds like code language to me a little bit. Academic politics prevented it. I think that means that there were legal barriers and maybe people knew what they were planning to do and it wasn't working. So they moved him to Montreal. They put him in a different country, moved him to Canada, where they had insiders. So you're wondering, like, why Montreal? Why Canada? And I wondered that too. So I looked further and I found that a very, very wealthy banker named Sir Vincent Meredith he was friends with Rockefeller, obviously, and Rockefeller must have told him what he wanted to do with Penfield. We've got this genius doctor. I think he can really do some interesting and groundbreaking research, but whatever it was they were trying to do, they weren't able to get it done in New York. So Meredith invites Wilder Penfield to come to Canada, to Montreal, where he basically owned Montreal at the time. So Sir Vincent Meredith, he came from a wealthy banking family, married into another wealthy banking family, and became the most powerful man in Montreal. He owned the Pacific Railway there. He was the president of the Royal Victoria Hospital already. He was the governor of McGill University, and he owned the main bank in Canada that was there. It acted as their central bank during World War I.
Wow.
So if you're thinking to yourself, this is a very powerful man. If he's running the bank and they say it saved the Canadian economy from total ruin in World War I, he's got the most powerful connections. The Allen family, if you know of the Allen Institute, the Allen Memorial Institute, which also ties into MK Ultra, that's the family he married into. His wife was from that family. So I think what happened here, this is a little bit of speculation, but it fits right together, that I think Rockefeller went to Meredith and said, look, whatever it is I'm trying to do with this guy, I can't get it done in New York, but I know you basically own half of Canada. Can we get it done there? So he says yes. He invites Penfield to go to Canada. And when he goes to Canada, they basically give him his own neurological institute with Rockefeller Foundation money. And he has total immunity to do whatever he wants because Meredith runs the hospital there. He runs the university there. He's in charge of the banking system. I mean, all of Canada loves this man and considers him like a savior who got them through the war. So I think it gave them carte blanche to do what they wanted.
Right.
So, one more little thing about Meredith is that he was a founding member of the Canadian Mental Health Association, and it was his idea to recruit Penfield there, and that the Canadian Mental Health Association was also known at one point as the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene. So we know what that's all about. And they formed this committee for mental hygiene, supposedly, guess what? As a response to all of the veterans coming home from World War I. Now, this is something that
all of the mental hygiene ones were supposedly the one in London, the one in the United States, the one in Germany.
They're all the history books say the same thing, that these hygiene committees, associations, societies were formed as a response to traumatized soldiers coming home from World War I. And you'll see, if you go look at old documentaries of shell shock, Tavistock Institute.
I was just going to say,
there's shell shock, shaking, and things like that. And this is one of the times where I do question. I look back and I go, okay, whenever they're all saying the same thing like that, and it sounds so scripted, it sounds like the media or the
Operation Mockingbird.
Yeah, they gave them a line to say, and they said, oh, we had to form these hygiene bureaus in response to traumatized World War I soldiers that we didn't know how to treat. So we were just doing research because we didn't know how to treat them.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
I don't know if I believe that that's sincerely what these people were really up to.
Yeah, I would question it as well. But I know that the Tavistock Institute that was one of their projects, was mental hygiene. So I think that they went and installed these, apparatus, because they are kind of like the head of the octopus for all of the propaganda narratives around mental health. And I know that was one of their primary objectives, was the mental hygiene. So mental hygiene, social hygiene. Yeah.
Right. So it sounds like the propagandists at Tavistock came up with this narrative and disseminated it out to all of these institutions who had these mental hygiene programs, because it kind of sanitizes the unethical human experimentation that they're doing and provides an excuse and all of that. So that's how this was set up in Montreal. So Penfield becomes the first director of the Montreal Neurological Institute at McGill with Rockefeller Foundation funding. He becomes a pioneer in brain mapping, and I thought this was interesting.
Yeah.
He did years and years of research with electrical neurostimulation, where he would put electrodes in people's brains, which is another thing we saw in MK Ultra quite a bit. And he was able to produce some pretty powerful hallucinations by electrical stimulation. Now, at the same time in the 30s, 1938, I want to say, 1938 is when Albert Hofmann and Sandoz discover that LSD has some hallucinogenic effects, and they're experimenting with that at the same time. So I don't think it's totally coincidental that just a decade later you have people like Aldous Huxley and a lot of the like Timothy Leary and the psychonauts promoting hallucinations as some kind of healing treatment or some kind of religious experience in the West and stuff like that. But he was producing hallucinations through putting electrodes in people's brains and doing brain surgery on them. And one last thing about Penfield, he became a fellow of the Royal Society in 1943. Like almost every other,
all of them.
All of them. They all become fellows
Yeah.
of the Royal Society.
Crazy.
So yeah, this is going on the same time that they're discovering LSD and making commercially available forms of it that are then used later in the 40s and things like that. One more thing I wanted to mention about like the whole philosophy of psychology and psychiatry, even though we have the medical establishment and their opinions about it, which is what most of us know, it's this medically based theory of mental illness or wellness or whatever you want to call it. There's a man named Dr. Thomas Szosz. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's a Czechoslovakian name. It's S-Z, maybe it's Saz, S-Z-A-S-Z. He's from Czech Republic, so their names are always fun. And he's pushed right up until he died, I think in like 2013, from the 50s to like 2013. He was really banging the drum and sounding the alarm bell, saying that he thought this biological theory of mental illness was wrong. He said he didn't believe there was any such thing as mental illness. He said it's not biological. There is no disease process we can find. So for instance, if a clinically depressed person commits suicide and we do an autopsy, we can't look at their brain and see a disease process happening. We can't look at a schizophrenic person, look at their brain and see disease process happening. And he followed this theory from the 50s all the way up to 2013, I believe it was when he died, and said, we have no more evidence now than we did in the 50s and 60s that this is a disease process happening in the brain. And he said what you and I said in our first episode, which was that basically they took people who had problems in living. That's how he described it, problems in living. In whatever way that might be. You have a bad temper, you're ill-adjusted, you can't handle emotional things very well, you're not very good at handling adversity, maybe you're confrontational, or maybe you're conflict avoidant. Whatever your problems in living are, you're maladjusted to living in some way, that they're calling this mental illness and trying to assign a biological origin to it, when he did not believe that that was a thing. And he said the difference was a heartbreak is not the same thing as a heart attack. And spring fever is not the same thing as typhoid fever and things like that, where he would say it's a physical disease process is not the same thing as some kind of emotional or mental effect. And you have no real proof that one causes the other. But you've been operating, the entire field's been operating off of this theory for over 100 years. And it's just accepted. And anyone who questions it is pushed out of the field. You're just pushed out immediately because of the institutional nature of the field of psychology and psychiatry. And so he would push back a lot on psychiatry and say that psychiatrists are the scientific high priests who basically replaced what we used to have in pastors and priests and religious guidance and things like that, where if you had somebody who was hysterical, you might take them to the priest. Maybe the priest would even do an exorcism, and that was not nearly as harmful as giving them a lobotomy or electroconvulsive therapy or insulin shock therapy. So he said that he felt the medicalization of problems of living as mental illness was like a really devastating thing to humanity that he thought was wrong. And he's always been kind of on the fringe, you know, the mainstream doesn't like this guy. But as I was reading him, I thought his theories were very interesting and made a lot of sense to me. And he said psychiatry is the state religion.
Yeah, I think absolutely.
Yeah, I do too. So if you guys want to look him up, his name is Dr. Thomas Szaszz, Szaszz. Just if you want like an alternative theory of how to look at mental illness, if you don't buy into the biological disease process theory of mental illness, he's interesting to look at.
Yeah, for sure. Somebody in the chat said that this ties to the Phoenix program.
Probably,
what's really interesting, yeah, and I think that's accurate. But what's interesting about that is that when I was looking through Tavistock during this time period, they were talking about the Operation Phoenix, and I got very confused because that's much later. And I was like, "What is this?" But that's actually what they called the restructuring of Tavistock under Bion when Bion came in. And it was all of this like group think type of research, very reminiscent of like Le Bon's work that they now, you know, them Matthias Desmond called the mass formation psychosis. But I think really what they were trying to do, and this was so fascinating, the most, I think, like relevant of what they discovered, I think they were, my speculation is that they were trying to figure out how to structure groups and then use those in order to, you know, craft narratives and control people. But what they found was that of course, you know, groupthink is pernicious and that it's contagious, the social contagion theory. But they also found that in groups, and people would then seek out a leader, but they would be most likely to seek a leader who was paranoid and possibly schizophrenic. That's who they'd be most likely to seek out. And I thought that was really interesting because, you know, somebody who wanted to control, you know, a population, that would be pretty interesting information to have. So,
well, and that makes a ton of sense when you think about, so if you, first of all, it's really weird that what they call it, Operation Phoenix.
Yeah, they called it Operation Phoenix.
And then later in Vietnam, the Phoenix program, a lot of the serial killers and even the serial killer cults were very tied into the Phoenix program. That would be like Manson, Dahmer, Son of Sam, like all these guys are rumored to be Phoenix Project connected serial killers who were also associated with various religious cults and things like that. It makes a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense why you would see like intelligence and psycho operation stuff inside of fundamentalist churches, whether it be the FLDS or even some of the like fundamentalist Baptist cults that are out there. Any of these really fringe religious cults, I think it's Jim Jones is another one that has recently been revealed to have not only intelligence ties, but ties to these kind of programs and to the military. I think it's a great setting for them to study this kind of thing and see how to make things like 2020 happen, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Most of us looked around ourselves in 2020 and went, how on earth is this possible? You saw, we've talked about this before, like how people reacted if they saw somebody breaking from the group think and how they were ready to kill them. It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense that they could do a worldwide psyop like that after having studied this kind of thing in these group settings, whether it be in cults, hospitals, military experiments, for 100 years at this point. They have 100 years of research now to look back on to see how they can do this to people. And then we've got mass media. We've got the internet. We've got TV. We've got the news. And who were the people who were doing all the modeling? Do you remember when people were doing the modeling for the 2020 event that happened? It was the Royal College London. It was Harvard. It was all of these same institutions putting out these models that are saying 2.4 billion people are going to die if we don't do blah, right? So
Right.
you can kind of look back and see how these experiments and these projects, they're all connected to the same people and institutions who
Yeah.
propagated this last event. So it's
I think
wild.
so. I think absolutely. Um, I think the one thing I wanted to add here, because you had asked me, and you said it here, like, why is it that these bankers are so involved in
Yeah.
psychiatry, for instance, and my instinct was that because a lot of these people, and I do still maintain this thesis, but that they're interested in racial hygiene, and so therefore if they could understand human behavior, that it would be a way for them to control and also figure out how to eliminate the useless eaters. But this was what was really fascinating to me. So it turns out that the Rockefellers actually were not interested in psychiatry at all, because it wasn't very fruitful, it was not scientific, it was not credible. So they actually really weren't interested in it at all. And it wasn't until 1933 where the Rockefeller Foundation Trustee Board finally decided that that's where the finances would go. And it was mostly under the advice of Alan Gregg. And so I tried to look into Alan Gregg. I'm like, why is he so invested in the field of psychiatry? Like, what is his motive? Where is this coming from? But it turns out that his mentor was Richard Pierce. And Richard Pierce, yeah. So
I
Richard,
didn't catch that because remember last episode I had a whole bunch of Ellen Gregg stuff, but somehow I must have missed that.
right. So I know,
Tell
and
me more.
it took me a very long time to find it. I did a lot of digging because I'm like, there's got to be a piece here, and I couldn't find anything on Richard Pierce. I did all this, like I kept typing it in, I was getting nothing. But it turns out that Richard Gray studied under Abraham Flexner. Now, this makes perfect sense because Abraham Flexner wrote the 1910 Flexner Report, which was responsible for taking Rockefeller petrochemicals into Rockefeller medicine, right?
Yes,
We now had use of
pharmaceuticals.
right, the petrochemical pharmaceuticals, and he studied, and so he advised Greg to put funds to guide the Rockefellers to put the funding into psychiatry. And
That's
I'm like,
amazing.
this was the missing link that I was like, because I really, other than the eugenics component, I get that, but there wasn't enough credibility around psychiatry for them to follow that. So it's like, why did they think that was going to be their key? But it turns out that's why, because now you have somebody who's invested in all of the petrochemical, pharmaceutical.
So that was basically the missing link there. That connection of, that they had cornered the petroleum market, which means they could corner the pharmaceutical market. And if psychiatry is attempting to prove that anything mental, emotional, psychological, social that goes awry with people can be cured with psych meds, well, then you've got what you have now, which is half the world is on a psych drug or a painkiller or something like that. I mean, 25% of all American adult women are on a psych drug. We've got, what was the stat I saw for kids? The last stat I saw for kids was horrible. It was like 18% of kids or something are on some kind of a psychiatric prescription at this point. And then birth control pill too. The birth control pill was another one that they were heavily involved in.
Yeah, that one is so devastating.
So,
and
that's nuts. Great find with that.
And it was another one that was literally born out of eugenics. I mean, Margaret Sanger and Bill Gates' dad. And I mean, it was literally born out of eugenics. And now they give it's the answer for everything. They pop the pill to, the birth control pill to like every kid who has a pimple or, is moving today.
Yeah, you have cramps, take continuous birth control. You have acne, how about some birth control? You have mood swings, how about some birth control? It's like, they use birth control off label for so many things now.
Yeah.
In fact, Jamie Hanshaw and I are going to be doing a stream on birth control next week, you guys. I think Wednesday is when we're going to do that.
Okay.
We may, I don't know if she wants to do a live or if she wants to record it, but watch for that next week because we have a whole thing on birth control coming. Um, so do we want to talk a little about Action T4?
We certainly can. Yeah, that one was
Or maybe just like the beginnings of it, or I don't
yeah,
know how deep we want to go into it because it is so disturbing, but
it's so disturbing. I do have quite a bit of information on also just Tavistock, that interim period. I
yeah.
don't know which one we can do because I know we have limited time today, so I don't know if you want
Yeah.
to do
Do that one first because we can always put Action T4 into the next episode because it kind of
the time
spans.
period.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It really
like I
spans
think there
the
was a
time
lot of
period.
back history that sets up Action
Right.
T4, but Action T4 didn't actually start till after World War II.
Yeah.
So, but they certainly set it up long in the 20s, strangely
Yeah.
enough. But yeah, so I was doing some investigation just, and of course, because Tavistock is now more known, but really it's like this hidden shadow think tank that there's very little information on. People always ask me, they're like, where would you find information on Tavistock other than their website? I mean, their website does have some, but their website is what they want you to see. So
Yeah.
it's
Of course.
it gives you a little bit of insight into what they're covering, and what, if you look at the propaganda, you can read between the lines.
That's usually what I do. I think you and I have a super similar research style because that's what I'll do. I'll go to their website, I'll look at their propaganda, and all it does is give me clues of where to look further to find out what's really going on, and then that's what I do. So
Oh, that's so fun. That is what I do. I was going to ask you, what is your strategy? But it seems like that's, we
pretty
have
much that. I pretty much go to like their most mainstream stuff,
Yep.
and because they do like to brag, so they like to tell you. They like to tell you their rosy version of what they feel they've done for humanity, and that gives me the clues. And because I think if you have a background in how these things work, then you know what to look for. You know exactly what little keywords or phrases or what little tips of where you should look and dig deeper, and then you make a little list and you dig through all the source material, and that's where it gets boring and I have to take breaks, but it's so worth it when you find your nuggets and you're like, yes.
I mean, seriously, I was searching forever for that whole thing on Richard Pierce because I was like, there's a missing link here. It just isn't adding up for me. And I was like, I mean, Alan Gregg was just kind of, I mean, from what I can tell, he was just a money guy. Like he just wanted to figure out how to make money. But it was his mentor who was like, here's the key. And so
there you go.
I have the Flexner guy in my back pocket. So
well, there you go.
Yeah.
So give us some Tavistock because you can never know enough about Tavistock. And I agree with you that it's like, it's the head of the Hydra that so many people don't know about, but its little tentacles are in everything.
Everything. And it's so people always ask me, where can you find information? So I would advise them to go, and people did ask after the last stream, they're like, can you give me sources? So I'll give a little bit of where I found stuff, but I do think go to the main source. So I started with their website and I looked through that time period because Tavistock has many branches. So much like it's the head of the octopus with many tentacles, it itself has many different organizations. So that I think is worth noting. And and then it has many nicknames. So like in the last episode, we talked about the Propaganda Bureau, which was also known as the Wellington House and had several other names as well. And then when it became Tavistock Clinic is when it started to be called Tavi. So insiders don't even refer to it as Tavistock. It's Tavi. they're on like best friend basis with Tavi.
Yeah, stop making it sound cute.
Right? I know. Tavi. So Tavi, really Tavistock Clinic, was in 1920 was when it really changed over from the Wellington House in Sussex. And I had talked last time a little bit about the reason for the name Tavistock was partly because of the location. It's in the Tavistock Square, but it was also because of the 11th Duke, the Marquis of Tavistock, who was John Ian Russell. And I know I mentioned this briefly before. I think it's worth mentioning again, not to say that Skull and Bones controls it or but I think that these connections are worth noting. And John Ian Russell is a descendant of William Russell, who was the founder of Skull and Bones. So he was very invested in donating the specific building for the shell shock therapy research, and that was done in 1920. But it was also it's known as the Hugh Crichton Miller Foundation.
Yes.
Crichton and Portman, right? So I was curious about who he was, and he has all sorts of connections. He was a physician, psychiatrist, and MD at the Uni of Edinburgh. He did his thesis on hypnotism.
Yes.
Right?
I do have a little bit on him somewhere, but yeah, keep going because I remember coming across him.
In World War I, he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps and as a lieutenant colonel. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister to the Scottish Church, which, we were talking about how they're always like
all the time.
Pardon?
Yeah, that's another thing we run into all the time.
Yeah.
There's like everyone's dad is a pastor or a priest in some church.
I commented on this and someone was like, no, they can't get married. So that's impossible. And I'm like, I don't know what to tell you.
Right.
I'm like, every time I do this research, I find they're the kid of some minister, pastor, or something. So I don't know what to say about that, but that's just what the research shows. So, but that was the big critique was, well, no, they can't get married, so they don't have children. So, okay.
I think the only people who can't get married are Roman Catholic priests, right?
That's what I thought. I'm like, yeah, so they're not all.
I'm pretty sure that Anglicans and Presbyterians, and I know Orthodox and the rest of them all can, as far as I know. So
that was my understanding as well, but I don't know. So he was the chairman of the British Psychological Society, which we covered that. There's so much overlap between them, the Mental Health Wellness Clinic Council, certainly the Mental Hygiene Societies. He was the president of the Royal Society, the Psychiatry section of the Royal Society of Medicine, and he was also the president of the International General Society for Psychotherapy, which I did not even know that there was one, but that makes perfect sense that these people are all involved in New World Order types of foundation. They're setting up for the New World Order, and I of course that it would make sense that there is this general society for psychotherapy that is international. My theory on that is they're paving the way to have like a global kind of council that could decide who is worthy of being existing, essentially based on psychological.
Remember Obamacare when they were talking about death panels and that was supposed to be a conspiracy theory?
I recall.
Yeah, sounds a lot like that.
It sounds a lot like that on a global scale, which is where they want to go next. He was, of course, the VP of the Institute in Zurich. Okay, so then we get into, this is also very interesting, and I actually found the letter that John Rawling Rees wrote, which I'm going to see if I can find that just to hold that up. But before I find it, it was in 1926. So they were a private, Tavistock, and I believe parts of it still are today, a private organization that's like a membership funded organization. Okay. And so when they're appealing for this research, it reminds me so much of the metrics of like social media influencers today. It's like, show me like your popularity, and then we'll see if you're worthy of us investing. Right. Yeah, I hate to think of it that way, that like they set the, they set up these trends, but they're Fabians, so it does make sense, that so now okay, I found it. So this was also very interesting just to see like the firsthand that he actually wrote a letter. So it was in 1926, John Rawlings Rees realized that they need to have, and this is because they're again trying to legitimize, right? So they now have the clinic, but they want to have a Tavistock medical psychology. They call it medical psychology. And so this is, of course, paving the way for Tavistock's psychiatry type research. And it was in 1930 where they did get this funding. and Tavi Clinic became Tavi Institute of Medical Psychiatry. And this is also where they move into the field of education. So they're starting to lay the groundwork for like types of education and all the things we're seeing today with the social emotional learning, and right. So that's kind of paving the way. This is back in 1930 when they're starting to lay that.
Well, it's funny because that 1932 Rockefeller Foundation report also talked about the need to, when we're funding and setting up these institutions, to make them educational institutions as well.
Yes. So, yes, exactly. And that was so John Rawlings Rees sends this letter. And what's really fascinating, I mean, he goes through the numbers. There's like a lot of money. Like, they're requiring $515 million. Then they also need and then he gives the breakdown of what that's for. But that's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money.
And they definitely talk about, like, the education sector of all of that. But what was so interesting reading this is that he keeps saying how, even though they do have this membership funding, that this is, they really need the Rockefellers to fund it because it's not popular. And so, I mean, of their own admission, they basically like say that the types of services rendered at the Tavistock Square Clinic is previously forbidden to local authorities, city administrators, and they're saying, but now is being permitted by a new law. And I think that new law was some of the, like social, what's it called, the sterilization laws that were put forth. They don't specify it here, but the timeline checks out, and so that now made their, but I just thought it was really interesting that they're pretty much saying that we're coming to you because we think you will be aligned. And they flatter them. They tell them that the prestige of this grant from the Rockefeller Foundation will be of great aid in influencing the action of wealthy and intelligent persons in England.
Exactly. That's how they sold it. They sold it as like, we can use this as a way to make sure. Wouldn't it be great if everybody in society was tall and beautiful and intelligent and super mentally stable, and we didn't have any crime and there weren't any homeless people? Wouldn't it be a glorious future if we could just get that's how it was kind of sold to them. And so it's funny, you're talking about this is in 1930 or the letters in 26?
What
did you say the letter was in?
The letter was actually what was the actual date? It was March 2nd, 1931.
Okay, and then the Rockefeller Foundation annual report is 1932, when they're echoing the exact same sentiment. So this is them writing a letter to the Rockefeller Foundation to court them for funding, right?
Yep.
And then in 32, the annual report echoes this exact letter saying, unfortunately, there's social taboos that aren't allowing us to do the work we want, but we know this is important. Here's all the reasons why it's important, echoing exactly what's in that letter.
Yeah.
So it sounds like Tavistock courted Rockefeller, and then Rockefeller bought into their propaganda, decided to fund it, and then put that in their annual report as the reasoning behind the funding. Very interesting. I don't know if anybody else has gone through and put this together before.
I haven't seen it. I mean, so again, for people want to look at so this is like an actual letter from John Rawlings Rees. So, I mean, I printed it out. I don't think you can see it very well. I really need
a little bit.
But, so, I mean, because I know people are like, where does this information come from?
Right.
And there's only so much information. But again, I think going through the sources. So when I was saying how there's very little on Tavistock, there's, of course, Dr. John Coleman's book. And then there's Dan Estellen's book. I have read Dr. John Coleman's book several times, and it is fascinating, but it's not sourced at all. Now, he does refer to some white paper documents, and you can certainly cross-reference. And of course, so much of it checks out, has played out. Right. So there's that as well. And then there's Dan Estellen's book, which goes into a little bit more of the like strategies and the kind of the tactics they've used, and he talks more about like Hollywood, entertainment industry, but he quotes mostly Dr. John Coleman. So now we're going back to it's a secondary source of a primary source that wasn't sourced.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So what I started to do, just to, I don't know if this is interesting to people, but just because that was one of the comments, they're like, where is this coming from? I tried to find who are these people and what have they written, because they've written a lot. So the next thing I found was an anthology of Tavistock and this historical overview, and it's written by Eric Trist and Eric Murray. So interestingly enough, Eric Trist, of course, he was one of the forerunning psychologists who was brought in during this time period. He was brought in actually a little bit later. And it was under John Rawlings Rees who brought him in. But he was the father of Alan Trist, who is the producer for the Grateful Dead. And when people talk about the LSD and the CIA infiltration, Tavistock has their hands all over that. And I mean, I can't show you the direct connection, but I can tell you that Alan Trist is the son of Eric Trist, who was involved in all of this. So I can't imagine that he wasn't somehow connected.
It's totally unrelated and completely coincidental. Yeah, just like how Jim Morrison's father, Admiral Morrison, was the one who did the Gulf of Tonkin fake flag in Vietnam. Yeah.
But no connection at all, right?
No connection. It's just happenstance. Total coincidence.
Total coincidence.
By the way, when we are done with this series, which Lord only knows how many more installations there will be, this is going to be a big project, so I don't know when I'll get to it, but we have a wonderful timestamp guy that's been timestamping these episodes. I have all my research. You have your research. Eventually, I would like to put this into a written format with the sourcing for us and either turn it into a book or put it on Substack or something like that, just so that it's written down and sourced and out there for people.
I have been dying to do, I obviously can't do anything until after, this is going to take longer than that anyway. But my next 2 months are pretty tied up. But I've been dying to do an actual book on, I was really looking to do on Tavistock, but I'd be willing to collaborate on something. And really the reason why is, one, because there's so little sourcing on Tavistock, but two, most of the sourcing we do have ends in the 90s.
Yeah.
And so much of what's going on today, I mean, when we see all these mass scale rollouts of things like 2020, it can't happen without the propaganda.
Right. And exactly.
They've been so involved in that. And I remember actually in 2020, I was like, what are they up to today? Because Tavistock was kind of what red pilled me. And so I was like, what are they up to today? And that's when I saw I went to the main website, just, and it was all of these lectures and seminars on transgenderism and acceptance of gender affirming and, it was just all of that stuff, queer theory.
Right.
And of course, what was it that outed them? Because really almost nobody had heard of them until the lawsuit against the transgender clinic that is under Tavistock. So I thought that was very interesting. But they're obviously so instrumental in so much of and they were also, they were the convergence of the Fabian Socialists and the Frankfurt School. Most of them converged under Tavistock. And I think that's very relevant because, again, those philosophies paved the way for what we're experiencing today. I don't think any of these color revolutions could occur without the codification of those principles. So
I agree. Yeah, for sure. So, gosh, we just need a ton of funding and multiple assistants and to get all this done. Because if we had 9 more of us, Courtney, we could get all this into books and documentaries. And I know. We're doing our best though, guys. We're working on it. We're trying to, because I want this to become part of the historical record, because so many people, a lot of people know this part or that part, but very few people can put it all together and show how these things develop over time, how they become institutionalized, and how this is what steers the course of history. That's why the series is called Crypted History Uncrypted. We're trying to show how over long periods of time, these ideas and philosophies, which are quite old, get institutionalized and propagated and become dominant narratives that control the social engineering of the culture and create the world that we live in today, right? So
we're
just doing our best to document it.
Yes, absolutely. So I don't know how much time we have, but a lot of what I found just under the, this time period of the 20s and the 30s was where they were creating these so of course, like all of these people who are involved have these ties to, things like the World Federation of Mental Health, the World Health Organization, all of these, different NGOs, but they were actually creating these different, like sectors so that they could be tied to reconnaissance. So it was, which I thought was just fascinating because, of course, we all suspect that Tavistock is essentially like a arm of military intelligence, and that's I mean, most of the funding, most of the founding, that's what it was centered around. But you wonder, where is that direct connection? And it was during that time period they created things like the Experimental War Office Selection Board. They created, handing over developed models for military control with psychiatric and psychological staff falling back into advisory roles where possible, removing themselves entirely. The War Office Selection Board and civil sorry, my ink like ran out, so I can't read this. Resettlement units were for repatriated prisoners of war. So they were creating these like different sections. I don't know how much time we have to go into all of it, but it was to give power literally to the psychiatrists. So I feel like they funded the psychiatrists. And if we want, I don't know what time do you have to
We've got like 15 more minutes.
Okay. Because I'm like, it is a big section to kind of go through, and I can start to go through it. But my theory on it is that they essentially, realize they need to fund the psychiatrists, but now they have to legitimize them, right? And they have to legitimize them, and through legitimizing them, they have to then turn over a lot of this, the power to them, and the power for military implementation. So so they, all right, let me see where we want to go. They had a group that entered the Directorate of Army of Psychiatry, who took the approach that for human, so they were basically taking like the like for instance, the shell shock therapy under the guise of, trying to figure out and help the soldiers. But then what they did was they turned all of that onto the civilians, and they decided that, well, if this is happening to the soldiers, then it must be relevant for civilians as well. And we're just the people to create the medical solutions for them. And so really they use this to justify, what looks like a lot of weaponization against civilians. So then, okay, so this wartime Experimental War Office Selection Board then disseminated a developed model securing the board acceptance for it, training large numbers of soldiers to occupy required roles. So they're using these theories that they've now codified in order to justify putting people into specific positions. All right, what else was there? So they commanded psychiatry as a reconnaissance activity leading to the identification of critical problems. Again, this is where they put them in power. Social psychiatry as a policy science, permitting preventative intervention in large scale problems. So this was during the 20s and 30s. This was the mission of Tavistock. The co-creation with the military of new institutions to implement these policies. And again, guys, if you want to know where this is from, this is Eric Trist, like himself. So this is not like somebody commenting on Tavistock. This is an insider.
What was his role there? Was he
was one of the directors at one point.
Okay, I thought so.
Yeah.
I thought so, but I wanted to make sure I was thinking the right thing.
Yeah. So he was the director of the post-war clinic. That's what he was.
Okay, gotcha.
Yep. And he later succeeded Thomas Wilson, who he was the chairman of the we'll get to him, but he was the chairman of the Tavistock Institute. But so he So Trist was he later succeeded him as the chairman, but he was also the director of the post-war clinic
Okay.
at Tavistock. But that's it. That's just it. During this time period, when they got this new funding, they started to create all these little branches. And I think that that's part of, to me, the way I look at it is it's like, I know people are familiar with shell companies. Like
Right.
corporations do this all
Yeah.
the time, right? They create like another name and another entity. And it's a way,
Yeah.
most people look at it as a way of evading taxes, but it's
Right.
also a way of hiding what they're doing. So
Yeah.
now they're able to run, because there's lots of so with companies, sometimes it's more innocuous, like it's just conflicts of interest that they're
Right. Right.
right. They're
And for
like,
legal reasons, monetary reasons, structural reasons, they need separate entities for different things they want to do.
yeah,
But yeah, this is something that I stumble across all the time too, is that these institutes, these megala institutions doing all this stuff, they do have like multiple different little entities within that are all kind of doing different things, and sometimes they work together. It also helps to compartmentalize, right? So if you're
yeah,
doing things you shouldn't be doing, you can more easily compartmentalize that to keep it under wraps than if it was part of the larger entity. But that's super interesting that basically, maybe I'm just crazy, but it sounds to me like they're making psychiatrists and psychologists kind of like the rulers of society in a way, because these people are going to dictate public policy. They're going to help, write laws. They're going to
yep.
give scientific basis for certain laws and policies and how the country is run.
And
And
culture, right? Cultural
yeah,
psychiatry for analysis of enemy mentality, therapeutic community as a new mode of treatment. Yeah, they're really, yeah, they're kind of making them and I think it's mostly because it is kind of arbitrary.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that gives them ultimate power.
that's
I
true.
mean, the
It's
people
not a hard
behind them.
science. It's
Exactly.
By the way, is psychology considered an arts degree rather than a sciences degree?
Yeah.
Okay.
Psychology it's considered a Bachelor of Arts.
Okay.
I
That makes
believe.
sense.
Well, actually,
I
I
I think
thought
so.
so, but I might be wrong. Let me look that up. A degree in psychology is a bachelor's in psychology. I don't know if it's a bachelor.
It looks like you can do either. It says a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology is more for like social work and counseling, and then
Okay.
apparently maybe you can do a BS in psychology if you're
Bachelor
doing.
of Science. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense.
but that in itself kind of shows that, is it a hard science? Not really. Not really. I mean, so that is very interesting. So when I think the average person thinks of a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they think, oh, those are people who help you when you're depressed or you have like a mental problem, right? We
Yep.
don't think of them as the people who are engineering society, making policy decisions, informing the entire military on how the military should be run, helping set up world banks and United Nations and things like that. Like, it was crazy to me to see how involved they were in creating the world order that we live in. They are very responsible in creating the whole entire world order. But on the other hand, it does kind of make sense, because as we talked about in episode 1, psychology is the study of the soul. It's kind of the study of humanity and the human soul. So it's like, I can kind of see it, but of course, from our perspective, we wouldn't see it as a good thing, because these people's view of it, as we've established, is a very like determinist view, like a biological determinist view, that these psychologists and psychiatrists are kind of philosopher kings, or they are like
Yes, that's
Thomas
exactly
Dad
right.
said. He said it's the state religion. They're the new high priests of the state who
Yeah.
are going to decide how things are run. And it's like, I don't think
And
most of us
decide
realize
who
that
gets
they're kind
to
of running
be.
things.
And decide who gets to be, who's worthy.
Right. Yeah. Who's worthy
That's
of
really
existence?
yeah. I mean, You know and now I guess I have a little more compassion for the whole argument I think I had with my mom like last year, because she's a psychologist, so she's probably coming from this indoctrination.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I mean, I know she loves me and she's not, she's glad I'm here. But yeah, I've never actually thought about that before. Yeah, it's coming from this whole worldview that, of course, certain people, it would be not only devastating for them, but devastating for the rest of society. And why should you have these people suffer? And therefore, we're going to just eliminate them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
So
I said that one. I was debating destiny once on Modern Day Debate, and we were having like a meta discussion, and he hates debating me because he's like, I hate your stupid meta level discussions. But I'm like, I'm sorry, but we have to have meta level discussions because I'm not just going to grant you your entire worldview. Sorry, I'm not going to do that. And we were talking about this, and he was trying to pin me down on the me believing in the existence of a soul as being turning me into like a goofy religious person who's superstitious and silly, and that he's the medical, realistic, pragmatic one in the debate.
Right.
And he was saying, I said, don't you think that like basically all of your arguments, if you don't believe in metaphysics, you don't believe in God, you don't believe humans have souls, you have this materialist view, by your view, if you want to eliminate suffering, why don't we just eliminate humanity? No more suffering. And he like basically kind of rage quit the discussion with me at that point. But I'm like, that's the natural logical extension of your worldview. If you want to limit suffering, well, then just limit existence. Just how about we just nuke the planet? Why not just atom bomb the planet into oblivion and then problem solved? No more problems because no more existence, right? But that is the logical extension of this worldview. But this is why the elites who adopt this worldview, they always imagine a future where they're in it.
Yep.
And you who cause their suffering are not in it, right? So
of course. Exactly.
So they kind of put their twist on it where it's like, well, not me, of course, but you, it's the same thing. This is the other thing I ask people who advocate for abortion and euthanasia. I say, okay, start with you. Start with yourself. Sure. If you want assisted suicide, you want euthanasia, you want abortion, why don't we start with you? I'm sure you suffer sometimes, don't you? I'm sure you've had suffering. We wouldn't want you to suffer, so why don't we just eliminate you? One of the
guarantees in life. There are two guarantees: you will suffer and you will die.
Right.
Those are the two guarantees. Right. But they don't seem to believe in either, right? The elites think that they're impervious because they will have all these technologies and accoutrements that will make them live forever, and of course they'll have the transhuman kind of assistance, so they shouldn't have to suffer either. Yeah.
Right. So
yeah. Well, so then we get to what they actually called Operation Phoenix, and I guess that this does go into post-war, so we can probably hold off on it. But just before the war, they had an election, and they created at the Tavistock Clinic. It was called the Interim Planning Committee, and so this committee was involved in how they were going to restructure the Tavistock Clinic, and the elected members were John Rawlings Rees. I'm just going to go through this little part because this is brief. John Rawlings Rees, who later founded the World Federation of Mental Health, Leonard Brown, who became a prominent alderman in the London County Council, Henry Dix, who was the founder of the field of cultural psychology, Ronald Hargreaves, who became the deputy director of the World Health Organization, Mary Luft, who retired after the war. They didn't have much to say about her. Tommy Wilson, who became the chairman of the Tavistock Institute, which was later the Tavistock Institute was and I'll get into the history on that. That was kind of interesting as well. But of course, it was the Rockefeller grant that made that possible in 1946. But it was interesting to me just because I keep getting different numbers on when that started, whether it was 1946, 47, 48. I knew it was around that time period. But apparently it was because of the Rockefeller Foundation funding that's why that number, the year, keeps shifting. And he became then they met twice a week for 3 hours in the evenings, and the group co-opted 2 people for the clinic who were not there before. It was Jock Sutherland, who became the director of the post-war clinic, and Eric Trist, who also directed and then later succeeded Wilson. So, but we'll get into them. But they were really involved in the post-war developments at Tavistock. And
post-war is going to be nuts when we do the next. Each episode gets a little nuttier, but I feel like the next few are going to be really crazy. And I think that's super important that you just made that connection there about these people being the ones who then after the war go on to be influential and important in like the World Health Organization, because a lot of people don't know this, but there was funding from the World Health Organization for MKUltra programs, and they knew about it. And you never hear that. You never hear about the fact that they helped fund and even sent some of these doctors to different countries to train and things like that. So it definitely makes sense now, knowing that a lot of Tavistock people ended up in the WHO and working with that.
And
so
the offshoots of the WHO. I mean, the World Mental Federation, like all the different offshoots of the WHO, they all work together. And it was Bayan who was the chair of the IPC. The interim committee. So we talked about him and his. I just think he's quite relevant because so much of the, I think the propaganda tactics they use stem from this group think. Of course, they call it malformation psychosis, whatever you want to call it. I mean, they've made it like I really think they've made that into a term because they want you to think that it's something new. This mass formation psychosis. I mean, it's really just how humans have operated since the inception of time.
Right.
Only the difference is now they figured out how to weaponize it so that they can induce trauma-based mind control on a mass scale.
Right. Which is the whole point of this series, is demonstrating how that happened. Right. So, I do have to get.
I'm going to let you bow.
Before we do that, I do have one dono chat here in my dono chat.
Okay,
From Nominal User 2021. Thank you so much, Nominal User 2021. Nominal User 2021 sends $25 and says, do look into the integral movement. That's where the new meta-narrative is being workshopped for the former New Agers. Okay, we will definitely take a look at that. The integral movement.
Okay. Yeah.
It sounds very social engineering-y. So.
It does. Yeah. Right. That's the new word.
That donation, and we will take a look at that. So yeah. Well, our next installation is going to go into all of the. So this was all setting up for the insanity that happens in World War II and directly after. Like the post-war period was pretty crazy with psych hospitals and MKUltra and government experiments and all kinds of wild stuff that was happening, in experiments with drugs and all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, they were already doing this here, and we talked about that a bit, but this was just kind of them getting set up and ready for what they unleash next.
And we'll go more into, we'll back up a little bit to give you the history of the T4. They called it Action T4. And then but that really was during that time period. It was a Nazi program. So fun stuff.
Very fun stuff. Anything else you got before we go, or?
No, I think that, what was it? The integral, what?
The integral movement?
Oh, the integral movement. Okay.
Yeah, the integral movement. Yeah. He says it's the new meta narrative that's being workshopped for the former New Agers, which, we've known for a long time that the New Age movement was leading towards something like that it's kind of more of a preparatory movement than it is an end even in of itself. So I will definitely look into that. So thank you for that donation. And thank you everybody for watching this series, because everybody's loving the series, which we love to hear. We've gotten such great feedback on it. So I'm glad that you guys are enjoying it. And we'll be back. We'll be back soon with another one. Courtney has her tickets for her Rebels for Cause.
Rebels for Cause. It's spelled out for, and we're actually, I'm just going to make this announcement now. We are going to cap off ticket sales 3 weeks before, because we really need to have everything in place at that point. So we kind of need a sense of how many people are coming by then. So don't hold off. The early bird prices are actually going to end soon. So I really do recommend you get your tickets now. I know they're not super cheap, but I promise the value will be there. It's a 2-day event. If you get the VIP, it's really like a 2.5 because we'll have a VIP meet and greet the night before. And we've got a lot of things we're working on, like a swag bag. So yeah, I highly recommend you get your tickets now. And I'm super excited. I can't wait to see all of you there.
Yeah, definitely go check that out, guys, and get your tickets for that. And we will be back with another installment very soon.
Yes. Thank you for watching.